Welcome to another episode of Art Heals All Wounds. I'm your host, Pam Uzel. On this show, we meet artists transforming lives with their work. Do you know what bird makes that sound? No? That's a gray go-away bird. What about this one? That's a capuchin bird. Okay, what bird makes this sound? No matter where you're from, you probably recognize the familiar cooing of pigeons. That's because pigeons are everywhere. We can learn a lot from pigeons. About love, for example. They mate for life. And about resilience. They were brought from the wild into cities about 5,000 years ago, and they have thrived. It's estimated that New York has a pigeon population of 1 million and counting. The other thing about pigeons is that they're really, really good at finding their way back home. My guest on this episode is Morgan Schmidt-Feng, a film director, producer, and cinematographer. His most recent film, Anton Circling Home, is a documentary about New York artist and pigeon enthusiast Anton van Dalen. Van Dalen has lived many decades in the Lower East Side, creating art that begins with his understanding of home, be it his house, his street, his neighborhood, city, or the world. Throughout it all, a flock of white pigeons that live in coops on his roof has been his muse. Today, Morgan, the director of Anton Circling Home, shares his notions of home as a theme running throughout his work as a filmmaker. You're listening to Art Heals All Wounds. First up, the art of conversation. You can get more information about this podcast and get in touch with me on the Facebook page, Art Heals All Wounds, and on Twitter and Instagram at Art Heals Podcast. Many listeners of this podcast live in India. If you're listening from India, I want to tell you how much I appreciate you. You're very much on my mind right now. For listeners not in India, I invite you to join me, if you can, in making a donation to help India in its fight against COVID. There are many organizations you can donate to, including the Indian Red Cross Society, the American India Foundation, and Oxygen for India, just to name a few. PBS has a long list of places to donate that will help medical personnel and citizens of India as they struggle through this devastating second wave of COVID. Up next, our deep dive with this episode's guest on Art Heals All Wounds. You're listening to Art Heals All Wounds. Listen and let us inspire you. I don't know about the rest of you, but the holiday season of 2020 was, for me, a dark time. Thanksgiving was a long, dreary day, being far away from my children and unable to gather with friends to celebrate. An equally isolated Christmas was on the horizon when I got an invitation to watch a film that was being broadcast on Dutch television. The film was called Anton Circling Home. It was directed by Katie Swales, Dennis Moore, and Morgan Schmidt-Feng. I was looking forward to seeing the film because Morgan, who's a friend, had spoken about it several times in the past few years. The opening scene of this film is during the pandemic, but almost immediately I was drawn into Anton's home and his life, full of family, love, and pigeons. When the film ended, I realized that something had shifted for me and that I felt lighter than I had in many weeks. I knew that I needed to invite Morgan to the show to talk about the making of this film. Morgan, thank you so much for being on this episode of Art Heals All Wounds. Before we get started with some of the questions I have, describe what you do.
Well, first off, thanks for having me on. I appreciate you taking the time and the interest in the work that I do. I, went to film school, and my dad's a filmmaker, and I've always had an interest in history and people's stories. And for me, having my first experience doing a feature film, a narrative fictional feature film with my dad when I was 18,
Wow.
sort of, I guess you could say I got bit or got the bug or whatever,
Yeah.
and decided to okay, I'll pursue film in school. And so at the core of what I do and what I love doing is really just exploring and discovering people's stories. And if there's an interesting layer of history in that, that's like bonus points for me, because I really enjoy all of that aspect of what's the legacy, what's the history, is there multiple generations involved in their life and in their story. So that for me is kind of like what I love the most.
Well, that makes so much sense when I think about your work that I've seen. The reason I really wanted to have you on the show is because last year you finished your film, Anton Circling Home. And watching this film really was a great experience for me. It felt like it came in the middle of kind of a dark winter and that long, long year of 2020 being inside, being cut off from people. And this film made me feel so hopeful. It felt almost like a turning point for me. I've been thinking about, well, why is that? What was it about this film? And I watched it again, but I also thought, well, I wanted to talk to you about how you came to make this film. If you could just give a brief synopsis of this film, Anton Circling Home.
I super appreciate the fact that this film affected you, because, that's so much of what is part of the reward of being a filmmaker, is to know that your work is affecting people in different ways and in powerful ways. And I think, that's what's unique about Anton and his art, is that he's always trying to look for a way to touch people with his work through sort of a window of humor and sort of having a bit of playfulness and sort of, I don't know if child naivete is the right word for it, but he definitely approaches his work with that kind of imagination as like how a child might see something, with a bit of that humor there. And so the film, really is about this man who, is originally from Amsterdam. He was born just before the start of World War II. And the war had a huge impact on him growing up. And it basically, changed the course of his life. And his father was a Calvinist minister, and was, an artist or an aspiring artist himself, but had to squash that kind of pursuit. And I think there was a bit of tension between him and his father his whole life. And so that's another big aspect of Anton's work, is exploring this idea of family and also home, and what a home means for himself and for others. And then his deep love and connection with his pigeons and his birds,
Yeah.
And he breeds them, he raises them, and he takes care of them every single day. Like they have, and multiple times per day.
Yeah.
And so his art reflects the life of his pigeons, the perspective that his pigeons have, and this connection that he has to them, and the idea that pigeons, you know, come home. No matter where they are, they come back to their home. And so I think that is another metaphor for Anton's connection with home.
Yeah. Yeah. The one thing I want to add, when you're describing it just then, it really makes it sound almost like it's all about pigeons. And it's not at all about pigeons.
True.
Yet the pigeons are such an integral part of this film. It is like the gateway into Anton as a character, into his heart, into his philosophy on life and how he views things, and even his own perspective on himself. And what I thought was just brilliant was, well, you know, I know your work, and you're an amazing cinematographer. I love everything that you do with the camera. And as I was watching this film, I really was thinking about that, how you have these drones, a lot of drone shots at the beginning. The one thing I thought when I watched this was that you really know how to use a drone shot. Like, to have the shots you have gives us that perspective of the birds, but also this side of Anton. Anton's life on the roof with his birds is so essential to understanding him and to understanding his point of view. There was another shot in there too that I just loved, when you start the story in the middle of COVID-19 and you are passing a camera up to Anton in a bucket to let him film himself during this time. And the camera is turned on. So we see this perspective of Anton as he's pulling up this bucket to the roof of his house, or maybe through a window, but very on an upper floor. And we feel like we're being pulled into Anton's world. And I just thought, oh my gosh, that's such a brilliant shot to bring us into this film. So I wanted to say that the cinematography really stands out in this, and that it's always so essential to the story. How long did it take you to film this with Anton?
So the first time that we filmed with him was in June of 2015.
Okay.
So it was basically 5 years from the time that we started filming with Anton to when we finished editing. It was 5 years.
Can you tell me how you met Anton? And then tell me, how did you know that you wanted to make a film about him?
Well, the unique story in a way about meeting Anton was my co-director and co-producer, Dennis Moore. He has had a relationship with Anton for a number of years prior to us filming. And we were, Dennis and I had connected in the early 2000s on a documentary he was doing that necessitated an interview with George Lucas. And I was working at Lucasfilm at the time, and I was shooting the doc stuff for Lucas. And so I volunteered to help out with the interview of him. And so Dennis, being the good networker that he is, he always stayed in touch over the years. And I totally had forgotten, but he had actually pitched me this idea of doing this film called The Ravenite, which is set in Little Italy in New York. And it's the writer Alec Wilkinson lived next door to the Ravenite Social Club, which was the Gambino crime family's social club. And so, you know, the film is a short documentary, and it's basically what it's like to cohabitate or live next door to the mob. And so through the eyes of this writer, Alec Wilkinson, who's a staff writer for The New Yorker. Wow. And so it turns out that Jim Jarmusch also lived next door to the Gambino crime family social club. And wow. Luc Sant is a historian, a New York historian who worked on, so, you know, he provided information for Gangs of New York for Scorsese. So, both of those guys were gracious enough to give us interviews for our documentary, given their connection to the story. And Dennis was like, oh, okay. Being the producer that Dennis is, he's like, where do we get a location where we can shoot that's going to feel cool and we have like full access and isn't going to cost us anything? Because basically, New York, it's crazy to rent a space, right?
Right.
So he reached out to Anton, and Anton graciously offered his art studio to let us film this interview of Luc Sant and Jim Jarmusch. Wow. And a quick personal note I'll say about Jarmusch was that he was incredibly friendly and gracious and was not at all, egoed out at all. Like he hung out and had a beer afterwards. So
that makes me really happy to hear that, because I really like his work.
Yeah, exactly. I was a little bit tense. I was like, okay, I really want to like him because I like his work, and so I'm happy that that both things were a thumbs up. Yeah. So Anton, being the New York artist that he is, who has like the hustle, kind of was like, hey, check out my work. What do you think of it? And Dennis, being the producer that he is, it was like, hey, I think we should film something with Anton. It might go a long way in just kind of smoothing things out and making it all good that we got to use this space. So I was a little bit like, I'm like, my head was in this documentary, The Ravenites. So for me to kind of step out and go into this other world was a bit of like, okay, that's okay, let's do it. All right. But I was a little reluctant to a degree just because I'm trying to manage my energy and my bandwidth.
Right. And your focus.
But Anton did have a story which didn't make it into the film. He did have a story about connecting with a mobster who was also a bird keeper. And so there was a connection there. And so we thought like, okay, well, maybe Anton could fit into the Ravenite story, but ultimately it didn't really work. And so we were like, well, we have this great footage. Let's see about doing at least a short film. And so originally it was intended to be a short. And then it was like 3 years later, we met with the Dutch broadcaster who was interested in the film. But they said, we'll only take it if it's a feature or a TV hour. And so, we were like, okay, this is the only little bit of money that we have potentially coming in the door. Let's do it. But that required flying to Toronto and shooting that part of his life. It required going to Amsterdam to shoot his siblings who were still alive. Because I felt like there's no way we could do a feature without doing that part of the story.
I agree.
And this was all on our own dime and time. And so Katie Swales, who worked as an associate producer on The Ravenite, was brought in as a co-director, co-producer, and the writer of this film. And Will Henderson-Nold is the editor on the film. And so it was a huge, her role in story, her role in doing the interviews in New York and in Toronto played a huge role in constructing the film and the story. And so, and collaborating with Will, the editor. And I will say that Will came out with me 1 year before the pandemic. Anton had his art opening, and basically Will and I spent like 4 or 5 days in a row filming no interviews with Anton, just all about imagery, all about like spending time with him, his birds on his roof, and really wanting to make sure that we turned every stone, visually speaking,
Yeah. There are also these incredible shots with him inside with his family, and then the shots of him on the street. I love seeing Anton like in his, New York world. I think New York was such a focal point of the pandemic and all this gloom and doom prophecy. And I just felt like when I saw this film, it's like, oh yeah, that's why I love New York. Hearing about this guy's life, seeing him out on the street, the different people he's encountering, the life he's lived in the East Village. I just thought, yes, New York is going to come back. It's like there is a culture there that no matter what other changes happen, you can't come in and wipe it away.
A big part of the reason why our the documentaries that I've done seem to take like 5 years is because, it's usually budgetary reasons,
Yeah.
and I'm juggling work that I'm doing on other documentaries as a cinematographer. I'm juggling work that I do with clients that are, for nonprofits, doing, work for them. And so, but in a weird way, I rarely feel rushed because I feel like there's a process that happens that can't be rushed. And I think that digital filmmaking has sped up the process so much that you can run the risk of doing something that hasn't had a time to properly ferment, and properly like grow its own way as an organism of creativity or art or filmmaking. And so I feel for me, this idea of being able to sleep on something or to dream on something or to take a shower and think about something, like all of that is part of the process of really finding the story, Yeah. And I feel like it's a blessing to be able to have that kind of time in some ways. And to have gaps of time between, where you can look at the footage and reflect on it and talk about it and then come back and have another opportunity. And certainly not every story or film has that luxury, I guess you could call it a luxury, but, and I've done documentaries where it's like we have a budget and we have a goal and a time frame that we're trying to finish things. So I certainly can appreciate that way of working, but I also feel like there's a certain groove that happens when you're doing a film that you're driving the deadline and there's not like somebody pushing you in a way to deliver, So
yeah, I think this is a word that's been used so many times, but his story is really a story of resilience. I mean, you did talk about his childhood, his relationship with his father. There's also the death of his wife. I'm curious, when did you know? I'm going to go back to the pigeons again because I just love their role in this film. He talks about that the pigeons are sort of like, almost like the one constant in his life. He started, I think he said maybe when he was 10, he started keeping pigeons. And now he'd been doing it for 70 plus years. When you were shooting this, when did you know what an important metaphor the birds were going to be?
I always thought from a visual standpoint that his birds were an interesting segue into seeing a world in a different way visually. But when I started, I didn't even own a drone. And there really weren't drones available that could do what the drone could do, a few years later.
Right.
So, so that was like a big, that was a big issue there. But I really did have this kind of moment where I realized how unique it was to have an artist who has a daily, multiple times per day obligation, connection, to care for these birds. I cannot think of another artist who has the level of notoriety that he has and the level of professional intensity that he has pursued art his whole life, that then at the same time has this huge time-consuming you know, obligation or responsibility to these birds, you know? And so I was like, that is something that is unique about Anton. But then his work reflects his birds so much.
Right.
And so, you know, there's not a separation between the two in some ways. And so that, I did have that moment though, where I was just like, okay, we cannot leave out the birds. And that was something that we really talked about in constructing the story, because we had to hit a TV hour for the broadcast. And so we didn't have the luxury to kind of go into these other worlds that we had filmed and wanted to include, but we really had to narrow our story. But I was really clear that we had to keep the birds as a big part of his world, because they are, you know?
Yeah.
And I do feel that there, you know, some people might find it like, whoa, why are we delving into the birds so much? Like, why are we not seeing his art or seeing him make art? And, you know, I really feel that you can't separate the two.
Yeah, and we do see him make art. I think, though, I mean, besides the drone shots, there are these really sort of intimate moments where he's sort of kissing one of the birds, like not, you know, but just like little, and but he's also talking about that, you know, he can't assume that they feel the same way about him that he feels about them. He has a lot of thoughts about these birds, and they're all it's a really unique hobby. It's not something that I've never met someone who kept birds like that, for example. And I think it's a very old-fashioned hobby in a certain way too.
It was vital communication.
Yeah.
During World War I, the bird and other wars. I mean, you know, human beings have been using animals to do all kinds of vital things. And, you know, we've come sort of disconnected with how vital animals were in our own survival.
Right.
You know, as we progress into the age that we're in now. But, you know, animals have played very vital roles in our survival, and birds were vital communication. When lines were cut during World War I, it was pigeons that might stop or start a battle that could cost the lives of hundreds of thousands of people.
Well, that's a great point. You're bringing up animals and our connection to them. And there are two things that it makes me think of. One was that he talked a lot about that a lot of his resilience came through nature, but for him, that is really talking about a connection with animals. I'm also thinking of another film that you made, so we're going to switch gears a little bit. This film called On Her Own, that also had to do with a very, very deep reliance and connection to animals and also home. So can you talk about what On Her Own was about?
Yeah, so in 2009, I was shooting a show, just like these little 1-minute vignettes of, you know, small, sustainable farms and ranches in California. And so I met this woman, Nancy Preblich, and her family, and they were a 5th-generation family farm ranch in western Sonoma County. And, you know, I only spent a few hours filming her and her family doing the work that they do. And I was like, I had this real connection, you know, with Nancy and wanting, and I felt like, hey, you know, maybe I could just come back for a day and film and give her the footage for her website to help them sell more, you know, more products to restaurants and farmers markets. And I really didn't see, you know, anything more than that. And so we connected a few months later, and I went out there with a photographer friend of mine, Anthony Lindsay, and we just spent the day filming, and I immediately was drawn into her story. And so again, it was one of these multi-year projects, and everything really changed radically for her and her family a year into filming. And so I just stuck with the story, you know, and Nancy would text me and say, hey, this is happening next week or today or right now or tomorrow. Like, you should come out and film. And I would. And so I'd drive up an hour north and do that. But, you know, my mom grew up in a small farming community in Iowa of about 300 people. And so farming is in my family going back generations. And so I always had this curiosity as someone who grew up in the middle of Berkeley, which is very, you know, pretty urban place. I always had this kind of curiosity about like what farming is really like. And I think I had kind of a romantic notion of it. And working on this film and working with Nancy kind of wiped away that romantic notion of what it is and how hard the work is and how backbreaking it is to do what they do. And I had, you know, and my mom always had this strong connection to family and to the land and to this sense of home. And Nancy, you know, being 5 generations on the same land, she too had that same strong connection. And I think that, you know, while Anton has lived in many places in his life, he's really settled down where he is now and has been for 50 years. And so, you know, there's this thread, as I think you pointed out, you know, with this idea of home and place and grounding. There's like a historic, or there's like a grounding that happens. And for me too, growing up in Berkeley, like I really wanted my daughter Maya, when she was born, my partner Susanna and I really wanted her to grow up in Berkeley, you know, because I did. And I felt like that makes, you know, where you grow up does kind of make a difference how you see the world. And I really wanted her to have the same opportunities to see the uniqueness that the Bay Area had to offer, you know, especially in the early 90s when she was born.
God, I don't want to do a spoiler for On Her Own if people are going to see it.
Nah, go for it. Go for it.
Okay. Well, part of the struggle for Nancy, she has such a connection to this particular land and her way of life. And she fights for it really hard. But ultimately, in the end, she's not able to stay there. And she has to leave. And so the rest of it I won't tell. That can be the details of why she's not able to stay there. People can see the film. So she has to relocate. And the whole film, as you're watching it, you think she'll die without this place. And in fact, she doesn't. Like whatever she has inside of her, she takes with her and is able to recreate a really pretty wonderful life where she sort of realized what she valued about her life before, and she takes it with her and she's able to create a new life. You know, I did want to talk to you about this sense of home, trying to hold on to it. What if you can't? Because I know that you have a particular story that resonates with me. It's not that different from my story either, but I'm wondering if you would talk about your experience of trying to hold on to a place that you love, which is living in Berkeley.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I really dislike moving. To me, it's time you never get back spent moving. And so I try to do it as little as possible. My work involves traveling a lot and being kind of chaotic, but I like to have a place to come back to, much like Anton's birds, you know, like come back to my nest. So for many years, you know, we managed to stay in Berkeley, but during the recession and, you know, we had bought a home after living in a rent-controlled apartment for 17 years. We bought a home that was like, you know, affordable at the time. Mm-hmm. And then the recession hit like a year and a half later or so. Mm-hmm. And, you know, being a single income self-employed person, like the loans that we got from the bank were really kind of bad loans. They weren't great, you know? And so between that and the recession, it was, we basically came to a place where when the economy had started to turn a little bit, we basically had to take the first opportunity to basically sell the home, sell our home in order to like get out of the debt that we were in from the recession. And I don't regret buying it. I don't regret living there. Maya got to have her own room for 4 years of high school and then another 4 when she came home from college, over summers, but we were living in a 1-bedroom with 3 people. And so that was definitely, a challenge. And I didn't want Maya to go through high school, living in the living room of a 1-bedroom apartment,
Right.
We were renting in Berkeley after we moved out of our place, and then that place was going to be remodeled, and so we had to leave there. And we knew that moving in that we only had a few years, and then it was going to be remodeled. So, we were looking around on Craigslist, and it turned out Fairfax had an apartment that was affordable with 2 garages. And so for my video equipment, it was really necessary to have that garage space. And so for the first time, in my life, I was leaving Berkeley. And so it was definitely a tough choice because of the fact that like my siblings live in Oakland, and I grew up in Berkeley, and my daughter lives in Oakland. And so it was a big deal to kind of uproot and go to a community that I had never lived in before.
And I just want to explain, if anybody is not familiar with the Bay Area, although everything's relatively close, each part of the Bay is very distinctive in terms of how it looks, in terms of the culture. So you were leaving the East Bay, which is Berkeley, Oakland, Richmond, which has a really distinctive culture, and going to the North Bay into Marin County, which again has its own very, very different culture. So it doesn't sound like a big deal, but it's a huge cultural shift, I think, to make that kind of move, especially if what your treasure is this particular East Bay urban environment.
Yeah. Demographically speaking, Marin is it's older and it's whiter. And there's only 275,000 people in the whole county. And, Oakland, which is part of Alameda County, so is Berkeley and so is Fremont. It's like, it's millions of people versus not even 500,000 people. And so the density just shrunk. While we do live in a neighborhood with neighbors and we share a wall in the duplex, and, we're not like out on a farm, but in general terms, like when I walk out my front door in 5 minutes, I'm in trees and, and there's creeks and there's, hundreds of thousands of acres of open space. And so in a weird way, it was like we went into the pandemic isolation before the pandemic, and it was more for economic reasons really than anything else, and it's been an adjustment, but being surrounded by nature and making sure that I utilize it every day and go out into it and not take it for granted has been really like life-saving. And so that part I really appreciate. And also the fact that it really is only about 35 minutes to get to Berkeley from where I live.
Right.
So it is much closer than I had always envisioned it being. But I do really miss the connection with family. I do miss the connection with friends that live in the East Bay and Berkeley and Oakland. And I miss the kind of energy that those cities have, that really aren't here. And I don't know. I don't know if we'll ever be able to move back to the East Bay or if we can even stay where we are. I mean, it's just really up in the air. I mean, we don't own the place. and we're renters. So yeah, it's kind of like, you know, it's a topic of conversation for myself, for my friends, for my family. Everybody's kind of reevaluating what home is and where will we live in the future, you know. And it's made more complicated by the climate change that's happening in the world, you know, and the disruption of a pandemic is making everybody reevaluate everything, you know.
Right. Yeah. I think it's, well, I have to admit, I sometimes have feelings about you and other people being priced out of Berkeley. I mean, I don't for a second want to pretend that, you know, city government of Berkeley doesn't care at all. But I feel like if you could gather a list of artists and what their body of work is who have had to leave Berkeley, I almost feel like they would be shocked.
Yeah. I mean, I know that your work has, you know, dove right into that, you know, that very idea. And and have posed those exact questions. And, you know, I think that the whole Bay Area is suffering from that, you know. And I heard an interesting thing that a guy said, I can't quote him verbatim, but I will say that the bottom line summary of his perspective was that the fact that we as a country do not have affordable housing as we did in the past, that there's a calculation that something to the extent of like 35% of our GDP is diminished by the fact that we don't have affordable housing. And that's because there's no room for people to be able to have the time to invent things, to create things, to start new businesses, or to create art and to innovate. And so there's a direct connection between the economic vitality of our country and affordable housing. And people think, oh, this is to have affordable housing is just throwing money to a charity for people who can't afford a place to live, or to get people off the street. But no, it goes much, much deeper than that, you know, much deeper. And I think what's super unique about the Bay Area is a generation ago when my mom moved here from the Midwest, it was super affordable.
I know.
You know?
I know. When I came in the late 80s, it was very affordable. And what really bothers me about all of this is that there's so much lip service paid to how valuable Bay Area artists are to the culture. But I feel like there's starting to be some effort towards getting some kind of housing, but it's so small. It's so small. And in the meantime, I do feel like, you know, the list of really gifted artists you've lost is enormous. You wouldn't even be able to calculate all the creativity that would go towards your community if you had paid more attention to this 30 years ago. Yeah.
And my dad's film, 1988, the remake, which was made in San Francisco in 1975, at the time, it was the largest open audition in the history of San Francisco. And people were invited to come and perform whatever they wanted to. And hundreds of people showed up to perform. And it was the most unique collection of artists and performers and that I've ever seen and have ever seen since. And so there was definitely a time capsule kind of snapshot of the Bay Area of San Francisco from 1975. And then, you know, later his film Emerald Cities, which was shot in 1979 and early 1980. Again, it was like this, depiction of San Francisco at a time that was super creative and affordable.
Right.
And those folks are gone,
I know. I would love to see those films, by the way, if they're available to watch. Morgan, thank you so much for being here and talking about your films. And again, thank you for making this film, Anton Circling Home. It really brought me out of a funk I didn't even realize I had been in.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to kind of, dive deep into, what resonated for you with the film and to hear, your take on it. And, we're showing at the Alexander Valley Film Festival, and, we're excited that other people will have the same opportunity to enjoy Anton Circling Home. And so again, I appreciate the time you're taking to talk about the film.
It's my pleasure. And if people want to learn more about you and your work, where can they find that?
They can go to www.filmsight.com, and that's filmsight.com. And come check us out. There's a co-videos project on the website, which is a lot of fun, and hope folks enjoy it.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
You're listening to Art Heals All Wounds. Remember to be in touch on my Facebook page, Art Heals All Wounds, and also on Twitter and Instagram at Art Heals Podcast. I'm so grateful to Morgan for being a guest on the show today. If you want to learn more about Morgan's work, you can visit his website, filmsight.com. That's filmsight.com. In the interview, he mentioned his co-videos project, which is a collection of films made by artists during the pandemic. I made a film for this collection called Sheltering and Displacement, if you want to take a look while you're looking at Morgan's website. I really appreciated Morgan including me in his vision of creating a collection of short films that present some perspectives of living through a pandemic. That wonderful gray go-away bird call you heard at the beginning was recorded by Peter Boseman. The capuchin bird was recorded by Gabriel Light. The music you've heard in this podcast is Yellow Light District and Autowaschenlage Instrumental by Lobo Loco. Beethoven's Piano Sonata No. 15 in D major was performed by Karina Galanian.